Marvel, DC, these are some of the greatest cinematic universes of all time. But what if I told you there was a third one, the UCU, Unemployed Cinematic Universe? As a result of this, we've now got a whole lore series as to why John Pork disappeared. In this video, I'm going to bring you through the craziness of season 1 of the John Pork lore. Subscribe if you haven't already. Everything begins with a character called Tim Cheese. He's essentially a rat that wears a tuxedo. He claims to be a mysterious hitman who took out John Pork, which he actually does on video. And that's not it, he proceeds to threaten other meme characters, including Agent 5.5, Pengu, and Marvin Beak. As a result of this, he'd actually kidnap Agent 5.5 and Pengu's wife, Dolly. In comes another character, his name is Simon Claw. Essentially, his backstory is that he grew up with both John Pork and Tim Cheese, except when John Pork became famous, he left all of them. Tim Cheese and Simon Claw were left to fend for themselves in the streets, turning to crime and thievery. Now, Tim Cheese would actually take Agent 5.5 and Pengu's wife Dolly to an island, and to invade this island, a new character would come into the lore. This is Bob Bacon. Bob Bacon is John Pork's older cousin. Essentially, he'd raid the island with both Marvin Beak and Pengu. However, during the raid, Simon Claw would neutralize Marvin Beak, and by the end of it, Bob Bacon would leave unsuccessful, but they'd return to try to get Marvin, which would result in Bob Bacon exchanging Pengu and his wife Dolly to get Marvin Beak. And to inflict maximum pain on Pengu, Simon Claw would take out his wife Dolly. So currently we have Tim Cheese and Simon Claw versus Bob Bacon, Agent 5.5, and Marvin Beak, as well as Bob Bacon. With the advantage, Simon Claw and Tim Cheese would then raid Bob Bacon's establishment because Bob Bacon runs an entire agency. Not only would they win against Bob Bacon, but they would feed him to Pengu. Agent 5.5 would then be in a forest, and during this time he'd stumble across the reboot van. Much like Fortnite, it has the ability to revive any character, but the catch is you have to pledge allegiance to the character known as the Architect. Not much is known about the Architect, but what we do know is that he can bring people back from the dead. However, you only get one chance, and pledging allegiance to him means you do his bidding. Agent 5.5 would do this, and instead of just reviving just John Pork or Bob Bacon, he'd revive them but fused, leaving them with two minds in one body. Then we get some backstory as to why Tim Cheese took out John Pork. It turns out that John Pork actually took his wife, Tina Cheese, where Tina Cheese left Tim Cheese for being too controlling and evil. Harboring all of this pain, Tim Cheese knew he had to take out John Pork. Fast forwarding to the present, we see Tim Cheese having a late night dinner with Tina Cheese. An argument would erupt and Tina Cheese would leave, but before she could, Tim Cheese would unalive her. Cutting back to Simon Claw, we know at this point he's in cahoots with Tim Cheese, but he makes a fatal mistake, deciding to leave Pengu alive. Pengu would then go on to leak Simon's location, turning to Marvin Beak and a new character, Jim Pork. This is the last Pork in the Pork dynasty and is the youngest cousin. And together with Marvin Beak, they would make Simon Claw's house erupt, leaving Simon Claw heavily injured and his girl in critical condition. Coming up to the scene, Tim Cheese would see Simon Claw in weakness. However, stating that he never needed weakness, Tim Cheese would betray Simon Claw, striking him at that point and also throwing him over a balcony. However, Simon Claw would survive, and instead of losing, he'd wash up on a shore, where he'd be contacted by an ancient ancestor, Simon Clow. It turns out he'd come into contact with his ancient ancestor who was a pharaoh thousands of years ago. And in fact, Simon Claw wouldn't be the only one to tap into the powers of old. Bob Bacon, Tim Cheese, and Marvin Beak would all experience an encounter with their ancient ancestors. However, Tim Cheese's ancestor, Tim and Cheese, turned out to be evil and would take control of Tim Cheese. Simon Claw would manage to claw his way into a forest where he'd be resting on a tree. However, soon after, Bob Bacon and Agent 5.5 would pull up. They'd press Simon Claw, willing to pull the trigger. However, smart with his words, Simon Claw would decide to collaborate with them, making Bob Bacon, Agent 5.5, and Simon Claw team up. We then receive some backstory as to why Tim Cheese betrayed Simon Claw. It turns out there was a huge disagreement during a bank heist. Simon Claw would try to leave, but Tim Cheese would try to get more money, and as a result, the bank alarms would go off, making them leave with a sliver of the cash. This would lead to a massive argument when they get back to their hideout, making Simon Claw destroy a photo of Tina Cheese. Finding this out, Tim Cheese would be enraged and pledged to get revenge against Simon Claw. Coming back to the present, we then get Tim Cheese taking out Simon Claw's wife, and contentions would continue to rise between Simon Claw and Bob Bacon. It seemed that the collaboration wasn't going well. They just didn't trust each other. Now the lore gets kind of dicey with Marvin Beak here. We have some storylines where Tim Cheese takes out Marvin Beak, and we have another storyline where he controls him. We're gonna go with the controlling him storyline, as this seems the most likely to be true. He'd notify Marvin Beak to give Simon Claw and Bob Bacon a special address to meet him. This would result in Simon Claw, Bob Bacon, and Tim Cheese all meeting on the roof of a building. The sun setting in the background, all three would stand in a circle, all ready to pull the trigger. But the unexpected would happen. Simon Claw, betraying Bob Bacon, would pull the trigger on him. And then, based off of the advice of Simon Claw, he'd convince Tim Cheese to take off the ring which Tim and Cheese was using to control him. But soon after, Agent 5.5 and Pengu would pull up on the scene and come in with armed forces. Bob Bacon would just barely survive the hit, hinting that despite the arrest, they could go to a new country. In fact, everyone might end up in Italy. And that's how season 1 of the John Pork Law ends. Now, after this, there's a whole Italian brain rot arc, and that's something else. Let me know if you guys actually want to see that. As for my opinion on the law, it's actually really good. Like, surprisingly, I've seen many comments saying that it's actually better than what Marvel's putting out right now. Bearing in mind, the plot line is actually pretty solid, and the fact that it captivated the whole internet just proves how good the storyline is. Now, I know it's not your conventional storyline, but give brain rot a chance. I'm actually pretty surprised that they were able to take a meme like John Pork and add a whole character storyline arc, add different characters that people genuinely got attached to and actually wanted to know what would happen next. And I mean, the lore is so in-depth that it's literally an entire universe now. Because by the making of this video, they've essentially gone through Italy and are fighting an Italian mafia boss. So it's like they could really take this anywhere. And this is averaging millions upon millions of views, so it's very surprising how far it's come. But yeah, if I had to rank the quality of this meme lore, looking at everything they put together, going from start to finish, the way the storyline perfectly flows together, the different main characters, so I'm talking Simon Claw, John Pork, Bob Bacon, Tim Cheese, and the other supporting cast is also pretty solid. I mean, we had some good character development arcs for guys like Marvin Beak, and guys like Pengu even had significant effects on the lore. So rating this lore 1 to 10, I'm gonna give it a 10 on the brain rot scale. Honestly, I feel like they did a really good job with this, and just comparing it to other things we've seen in the past, this is definitely the best piece of meme lore we've ever seen. Other times people would just make clips or just talk about things and make things up, but this is actually a whole cinematic universe. And this is the first time I've actually seen this go mainstream. And honestly, now that we're still here, we actually made the news with this. Yes, we somehow made the news for the John Pork Law. I don't know what they're doing in the Netherlands, but they really got reporting on John Pork with us in it. Crazy work. But yeah, it's super exciting to see what they've done with John Pork. But yeah, shout out to the creators of this. But that is the reason why John Pork disappeared, and the unemployed cinematic universe decided to go crazy. But yeah, the lore is absolutely outrageous. Being able to predict what would happen next was near impossible. But yes, the lore was peak, you just had to be there to see it. That's how John Pork disappeared. Let me know what you want to see next. Join the Discord, subscribe to my YouTube, like and follow for more.